Thank you for the opportunity of presenting our exhibit, The Chief, to you. We hope you enjoy. We ask you, please, no flash photography or video recording at any period during this tour. Thank you for your cooperation. We will now be entering the first room labeled on your map as Early Life. Marshall was born in Prince William County, which is now Fauquier, Virginia, to Thomas Marshall and Mary Randolph Keith on September 24, 1755, in a log cabin. Marshall served the Continental Army as lieutenant in the Culpeper Minutemen and was friends with George Washington. After retiring from the Army, he studied law under Chancellor George Wythe at the College of William and Mary. Years later, he was appointed to the Supreme Court as Chief Justice by John Adams. He is the longest-serving Supreme Court justice, and he served from January 31st, 1801 to July 6, 1835, 34 years. John Marshall set the precedent for the Supreme Court from the very beginning to now by stating that the only people who can say the Constitution is unethical would be the Supreme Court. Marshall was always a charismatic man. He could bring men together at the drop of a hat. His charisma was forceful in his personality. Some say that this was an influence to men who knew the law. John Marshall shaped the court's decision and raised its stature to where no one thought it would ever go. As Supreme Court Justice, Marshall played a very important role in many important cases throughout U.S. history. In the next phase of the exhibit, you will learn about a few of his most famous cases. The first of these cases is Marbury v. Madison. We will now be entering the room labeled on your map as Marbury v. Madison.
The Marbury v. Madison case was one of the most important court cases in Supreme Court history. During this case, John Marshall did something no other judge had done before. He said and agreed that an act of Congress was unconstitutional. This then reinforced the doctrine of judicial review. Since John Marshall branched out and made this decision, he set a precedent for the Supreme Court. This decision made the Supreme Court the only people who can rule something unconstitutional. This then made the Supreme Court as powerful as it is today.
Going into some artifacts, this, shown on the screen, is a copy of the original judicial review document. Also, this quote represents what was established at the Marbury v. Madison trial. Another one of his famous court cases would be the Cherokee Nation versus the state of Georgia. We will now be moving into the room labeled on your map as Cherokee Nations versus Georgia.
When the state of Georgia tried to force the Cherokee Nation out of their land, the Cherokee sued Georgia, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court. John Marshall made the ruling that the Cherokee Nation was not a foreign state, and that Georgia could not force them off their land because they have ownership of it. Here you see a document recording the court ruling. This was the first time that land rights and ownership came to be, because Marshall said that if someone owns the land, you cannot take it from them, and it would be used many times after that. The Cherokee only got to keep their land shortly, however, because Andrew Jackson used military power to force them out of Georgia into present-day Oklahoma on the Trail of Tears, shown here. The last famous case that this exhibit covers is McCulloch v. Maryland case. We will now be moving to the room labeled on your map as McCulloch v. Maryland.
The McCulloch v. Maryland case of 1803 dealt with the supremacy of federal law over state law. The case came to the Supreme Court when the state of Maryland claimed to have the power to tax the National Bank because its branch laid in state lines. The National Bank argued that states don't have the power to tax the federal government, so they can't tax the federal bank. The necessary and proper clause of the Constitution, which implies that the states can't tax the government, led Marshall and the Supreme Court to rule in favor of the government. This ruling defined the national power of the government for the first time in U.S. history. Through their decision, the court gave Congress the power to enforce laws that are only implied by the Constitution. This document is the original Supreme Court decision text of the McCulloch v. Maryland case. On a worldwide scale, the McCulloch v. Maryland case set a precedent for the Australian Federation. While facing a similar situation in 1904, the Australian court used this case's ruling as a guideline when determining the relationship of the Commonwealth federal government and the federal states of Australia. As you can tell from these three important cases, John Marshall, while serving as Supreme Court Chief Justice, played an important role in U.S. law. Our last stop on the tour shows a few ways of how our country remembers the Chief John Marshall. Our country recognizes John Marshall's influence in a few different ways. There have been many education centers dedicated to him. most popular of them being Franklin and Marshall College in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, which has gone on to be the nation's foremost liberal arts college. Law schools that bear his name include the Cleveland Marshall College of Law in Cleveland, Ohio, John Marshall Law School in Atlanta, Georgia, and the John Marshall Law School in Chicago, Illinois. Also, there are a number of high schools around the country named after him. Another way he's been honored is by the John Marshall 40-cent Liberty issue postage stamp that was put out by the U.S. Postal Service in 1995.
John Marshall died on July 6, 1835 in Philadelphia, PA. You can visit his memorial in Shuckoe Hill Cemetery, Virginia. We'd like to thank you for allowing us to present to you our exhibit, The Chief. If you could, please enter into the room Early Life and make your way down the stairs to the closest exit. Thank you, and we hope to see you again soon.